Good day, everyone. Welcome to our session here on Do No Harm, a fresh perspective on human trafficking. I'm about to turn a recording on. Great. So welcome. We're thrilled to have you here today. Thanks for joining us for this session from wherever you are. I see a few folks saying hi in the chat. Please feel free to do that. Let us know who you are, where you're joining us from. My name is Leah Watkis, and I am with the Collaborative Network to End Exploitation, who is putting on this webinar series. So we'll open with a land acknowledgement. Toronto, which is where the Collaborative Network to End Exploitation is situated, has been a home to many nations since time immemorial. These include the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. These nations were irrevocably harmed by the arrival of European settlers who have systematically tried to erase these Indigenous communities and their teachings. In our ongoing journey towards reconciliation, we are relearning the history of this country and this land, critically examining the ways we have benefited from systemic racism. We are committed to redressing these harms. Just a few housekeeping pieces before we move on to our main speaker. This webinar series is being commissioned by the Collaborative Network to End Exploitation, and it's funded by the Sisters of St. Joseph of Toronto. But the presenters are all representing their own views. You will be muted for the presentation portion. You're invited to ask questions using the chat features. We will be turning the chat off during the main part of the presentation, just to avoid it distracting folks, but we'll be turning it on towards the end of the presentation so that you can ask your questions. We are recording this, and you will have access to the recording later. And there are captions available that can be turned on at any time. If you look at the ribbon at the bottom of your screen, there is a little icon with the CC. And if you click on that, you can turn on captions. So today is part 4 of our 6-part series on Do No Harm. Throughout the course of this webinar series, we are looking at some of the ways that those engaged in anti-human trafficking efforts can sometimes end up causing harm. So if you haven't seen our first webinars, we did anti-oppression and human trafficking work. We had a section on sex workers, we had a session on migrant workers, and today we're focusing in on youth on the margins, preventing trafficking by advancing equity. As we move ahead, some of the assumptions that we have of those who are here today, we are assuming that you are already familiar with the topic of human trafficking and what anti-human trafficking work entails. So we're not doing human trafficking basics or human trafficking 101 here. We assume that you're here with good intentions and you want to learn more, and that you understand that discomfort is part of growth. And here I've added a quote from Maya Angelou that says, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." So we're assuming that everyone who is connected in here is doing the best that they can, but hopefully at the end of this session, you're going to know better and you'll be able to go forth and do better. And that's a really exciting piece of this work for all of us to be involved in. So thanks so much for being here. And now I would like to introduce our presenter today, Asha Dahir. Her pronouns are she and her, and she is the Community Engagement Manager and Coordinator of the Human Trafficking Peer Prevention Project at Aura Freedom. Asha is a youth advocate for ending gender-based violence. Asha has over 5 years of experience engaging with young people with a focus on marginalized youth. Asha is a first-generation Somali Canadian and brings aspects of her identity to the work she does in ending gender-based violence and human trafficking and advancing equity. Aura Freedom is a Toronto-based grassroots feminist organization working to eradicate gender-based violence and human trafficking in Canada and beyond. We're thrilled to have you here, Asha. Thank you so much for being with us. I will pass things over to you.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning from wherever folks are calling from. Thank you so much for having me today. And I want to thank the Collaborative Network to End Exploitation for hosting these amazing webinars. It's been so great. The past 3 that's been before me, and I know 2 that are going to be after me from Ronell and Melissa, which I'm super excited about. So similar to what Leah was speaking about, so today I'm going to be speaking about how Aura Freedom does no harm or tries to do no harm when it comes to preventing human trafficking and advancing equity towards youth specifically. So I'm really excited to speak about folks about this conversation, especially we know with the pandemic currently going on, we know that youth are spending majority of their time, if not all their time online, which makes them so much more vulnerable to online exploitation. So I'm so eager and so excited to share some of our methods, to share some of the things that we do here at Aura Frida for folks on the call today. But in a ways that we do no harm, we first need to acknowledge the land that we are on. So we want to play this video by Melissa Compton, who's actually going to be doing a webinar here on, I believe, April 27th. So Melissa is an Indigenous educator and frontline gender-based violence worker, and she's going to be doing our land acknowledgement today via video.
Kwe nen Taluizi Malgigana Madiz Eschik Jagamich, Taluizin Tohumguk, Wigi Takaranto. So hello, my name is Mel Compton. My spirit name translates into Strong Tree Spirit. And originally I am from Newfoundland, but I was born and raised and I currently live in Takaranto. So I'm here to present a land acknowledgement. And so here we go. So we acknowledge the land that we are meeting on in Takaranto as the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples that is now also home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I also just want to say that I am honored to show face for Aura Freedom. I've done a lot of work with Aura Freedom over the years and supporting Indigenous populations and specifically Indigenous youth through human trafficking. The projects have been amazing and they've always made space for myself, the youth that I've worked with and the community that I've worked with to come in and have their voices be heard, which is very rare to actually see that our community has a voice and that voice is empowered. And Aura Freedom does a really good job of that. So Walalan, Miigwech, Nyawa, and thank you for being here. And I hope you enjoy the event.
So thank you so much, Mel, for that beautiful land acknowledgement. We know that we cannot and we will not address gender-based violence without addressing colonialism, systemic racism, and the impact and the harm that it has on Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples. And again, Mel is having her presentation on April 27th on Indigenous Voices, the perspective on human trafficking. So I really encourage folks to sign in and tune into that amazing webinar that's going to come. But Leah already kind of introduced me. So hello, Ramadan Mubarak to folks who are fasting. It is the month of Ramadan for our Muslim brothers and sisters. My name is Asha Dahir. I use the pronouns she and her. I am the Community Engagement Manager and Project Coordinator for the Peer Prevention Project, which I'm so excited to be speaking about folks about the project that is targeted for youth by youth. And I'm really excited to bring in my perspective. As Leah mentioned in my bio, I've been a youth advocate working with marginalized youth for over 5 years and just really trying to create safe spaces for youth to be heard, to be listened to, and to feel safe and valued, because we know that is such a hard thing for youth, especially being online and things like that. So before we dive in, we want to get into who we are. So if we can go to the next slide, awesome. So Aura Freedom is, in the name of gender equity, we are a grassroots women's organization that works to end gender-based violence and human trafficking through advocacy and education. So our heart is to really work to end gender-based violence, and how we do this. So this is kind of in conversations with today's webinar on, okay, how do we do no harm when it comes to speaking about human trafficking specifically for youth, is that we use intersectional feminism. If we can go to the next slide. So we use intersectional feminism, equity advancing education. We address the root causes of gender-based violence, and we believe that is the only way to really address gender-based violence. And I'm going to go through how is it that we address gender-based violence? What are some of the outlooks and viewpoints that we kind of go through when speaking about gender-based violence and human trafficking? We highlight marginalized voices, and we challenge the status quo that is there. This is how we do no harm. We are trauma-informed and survivor-centered in the way that we do our work. Our belief is that gender-based violence is preventable and that education is everything. And to really trust the grassroots organizations. In the next slide, it showcases that we are really at the heart of everything. We really focus on that education piece and that advocacy, and to really use that inclusive intersectional education that addresses the root causes of gender-based violence and human trafficking. So let's speak about the way we here at Aura Freedom address human trafficking in a way that does no harm. So we know that human trafficking is the manifestation of inequity. Exploitation, like gender-based violence, thrives in those conditions of inequity. So we know that there's no quick fix to fixing that, but we really need to take an approach that zooms out. We really need to look at the power imbalances and the inequalities that are there. So if your work, your anti-trafficking work, is not addressing inequities of gender, race, socioeconomic status, and more, then it simply won't be effective. We believe from our methods and the work that we've been doing, and also the data that I'm going to be sharing with folks as well, that when addressing those root causes, when really amplifying the voices of marginalized communities, this is how we can end gender-based violence. This is how we can advance equity. If we go to the next slide, we know that it's more, it's about more than convincing traffickers. So we know that human trafficking is highly underreported. And many of the survivors that we actually work with here in Aura Freedom, particularly like our youth, they never report their traffickers to the police because of the fear of the mistrust that is there with authorities. Many of our youth, especially racialized youth, don't feel safe when it comes to engaging with law enforcement because of the history of mistreatment and mistrust. So we really need to highlight, okay, then there needs to be other ways that we need to address this. And that's why we use holistic approaches when it comes to supporting our survivors. And if it means not going to law enforcement to report incidents that can become more harm towards them, we need to address what are other ways that we can do that. So why we're kind of all here today is to speak about our peer prevention project, which is in the next slide, on how we do no harm. So I'm really excited to speak about the HTPP program, which stands for the Human Trafficking Peer Prevention Project, because it's like my little baby, because this is the start from 2018. I actually started in as a facilitator when this project was first coming about, and then I transitioned as a coordinator, and now as a community engagement manager and a coordinator of this project. So I really hold this project close to my heart. But the HTPPP really brings awareness and prevents human trafficking and sexual exploitation in the GTA by advancing equity through presentations that are for youth by youth. And I'm going to continuously bring back the topic of today of do no harm. So the ways that we do no harm when it comes to the HTPP program is using youth language in the ways that we facilitate our workshops. We all identify as youth going into these workshops, and bring in our perspective, our lived experiences. Some of the folks on our team are survivors, bringing in that perspectives to support youth in having these conversations. Folks can see here on the screen, this is our workshop kind of breakdown on what we cover. We are going to be sharing samples of our presentation that we actually do for our youth, but we really do that HT 101 going into the overview of human trafficking, as well as the luring and the grooming. But the ways that we do that and do no harm and go deeper is those root causes, identifying marginalized communities, looking through the systemic racism, systemic barriers. But I'm going to be speaking about that a little bit more as we go on. But I wanted to share with folks in the next slide some of the resources that actually come with our workshops when we do them with youth. So of course, prior to COVID, we were in person, and now we have transitioned online. So we continue to have our workshops for youth, as we know that there's a high need for that. So when it comes to visual aids, as you can see here at the bottom are our postcards that we actually share to youth. So prior to COVID, when we would go to schools, shelters, community centers, anywhere that youth were, we would put all of these postcards on youth's desk and places where they would sit, so that when they leave, they have this information with them that has some resources, as well as some signs that they can read for and support, maybe for a friend, for themselves, that they can take away with them. We do activities that are youth-centered. So in the conversations that we're having with youth, primarily, and I'm going to speak about this a little bit later, when we do our workshop, we speak about consent and healthy relationships, because we know that a lot of the survivors we worked with actually didn't know that that this was their, like, they believe that this was their choice in terms of when the exploitation and the trafficking began. But really, we unpack the differences between consent and coercion and how that actually could serve. And there was no consent there. They had no choice to even consent. It was all coercion, manipulation, and blackmail. And we unpack healthy relationships with our youth too, in ways that are fun, because this conversation can be very heavy. It can be very hard to have. So we try to have some activities to really make it in a mindful way that is trauma informed, to unpack with our youth. So for one example, when we speak about healthy relationships with our youth, which is super important, especially when it comes to talking about human trafficking, because of those unhealthy relationships that can be there, maybe from viewing it from households, from schools, from friends, and not really knowing what is a healthy relationships. So one example is we do this activity on boundaries. So when we were in person, I would put a tape on the ground for our youth, and folks would stand on there. And I would let folks know that, okay, I'm going to be reading some prompts as examples. And if you feel like this is one of your boundaries that are crossed, you can either move forward to say, you know what, this boundaries didn't really cross, or go behind and say, this crosses my boundaries. And we do this activity to really showcase to the youth, like, we all have different boundaries, and that is okay. Because many of the youth that we've worked with believe that they should not have any boundaries, that they should, go with whatever occurs and be okay with whatever happens. But we really try to emphasize that, it's okay to create healthy boundaries, and everyone's boundaries is going to be different. So some of the youth would be forward, some would be behind, and we would unpack it and discuss it. And at the end, showcase that we all will have different boundaries. And this is so meaningful, because this is some of the root causes. This is something that they really hold onto them and cherish. We also have a trauma counselor who is trained in human trafficking and works through an intersectional trauma-informed lens, and comes with us to every workshop that we have. And this, again, is how we do no harm, because we know the topic that we do have, it is very hard to have, and it's hard to kind of digest, that we do need an on-site trauma counselor for when we do have disclosure, so that they can support the survivors that we're with. And I'll be sharing more about that as we go on. So why youth facilitated? I kind of spoke a little bit about why we're youth facilitators, because we can use that youth language. And when youth see themselves in another youth, they can really relate to them, and they can feel safe Youth also look to us as leaders, and they can see that, we are empowered in the way that we're speaking about this conversation, to where they feel like they can also be empowered too. And this is huge, especially with our team being very diverse, for youth to really see themselves and be like, okay, you know what, like, this person who's speaking to me looks like me, sounds like me in terms of the language that they're using. They're going to be more susceptible to taking in the information and the supports that are there. So now we can go to the next slide, which this is my favorite part, which is our training curriculum. So before our youth team could even go in and facilitate these workshops for the Human Trafficking Peer Prevention Project, it started first with us. So when we first came on, we did 5 months of training. Literally 5 months before we did any workshop, before we did any speaking engagement, we were first trained so that we could be empowered, we can be confident and educated in the topic that we were going to go out and speak to youth about. And this created that huge change. And this is how we continue to do no harm when it comes to this topic. We got gender training. I'm going to name a few. I can't name them all, but we got like gender training by White Ribbon. We had anti-Black racism training by Justine. We had trauma-informed training by Dennis Windigo, who is an Indigenous elder. We had anti-oppression LGBTQ2S+ training by the 519. We had violence against women training by TRCC, and we had migrant working immigration and refugee training by FCJ, just to name a few of the many that we've been so fortunate to be able to have. But this is how Or Freedom, this is how we do no harm. We first start with the team that we have to train them, to ensure that they're confident and they have the resources and the toolkit to do what they need to do to facilitate these workshops. So we often hear that anyone can be trafficked, and where that is true, but however, we know that there are communities that are more at risk for exploitation and that have historically been targeted. And this is why we do the work that we do when it goes into the next, if you can go to the next slide, where our main focus goes back to the root causes. So gender equity, patriarchy, and speaking about rape culture, when it gets into speaking about systemic racism, colonialism, homophobia, and the impact that that has on human trafficking as well. And specifically for marginalized communities and how different that can look like, as well as we speak about poverty and the gaps in social services, housing, and child services, and the child welfare system that is there, and the gaps that are there. Because when we speak about these issues, this is how we can dig deep, and we're not really going at the surface level. We're really trying to create systemic change. And to do that systemic change, we have to look at our history. So just looking for time, we're still good. I know I'm blabbering a lot, so folks who do have questions, I know that the chat box currently right now is off, but please remember some of the questions that you have so that we can have a really nice discussion at the end. But as I mentioned, I wanted to showcase some of our samples from our peer prevention project. So I'm not going to be going in detail of all the information that is on these slides and how we speak about it to our youth, but I did want to highlight it to folks to showcase what do we speak about and how do we speak about it. So I keep speaking about the root causes, and one and foremost is going into gender. So we speak about how being a girl is still the biggest risk factor there because of the gender inequity, the objectification of women and girls and those who identify, and really speaking about that, the objectification of girls, that when only the value of girls and women come from the way that she looks like or what pleasure she can do for other people. And this kind of goes into that hypersexualization of girls and women, from culturally, from different ages, from how we even see things in society. As you can see here, this little comment strip of really hypersexualizing women and girls, to where there's this gender expectation that women and girls have to be super sexualized. This is, to be a woman and girl, you have to be of this way. And if you are not, there's those barriers and issues that occur. But we're not saying that being sexy is an issue. We are not completely at all. But what we're saying is that, you know, women have brains too. Women have so many other amazing characteristics as well as a whole. So we really need to address that these are dangerous viewpoints and the dangers that it legitimizes and exacerbates violence against women. So this is how this kind of the birth of violence against women comes about, when the objectification of women and girls come from a very young age, the gender inequality. So we speak about that to, you know, have conversations with our youth. We also go into the hypermasculinity and the toxic masculinity and the connection that it has with violence. And we know we've heard so many times these phrases of, you know, stop crying, toughen up, grow some balls. And these are some of the language that is being put out there towards those men and boys and those who identify that they are not allowed to be emotional, and the harm that comes from this. You know, men also have their own gender box, as you can see the gender expectation on the right hand side. And you know, again, the language of having to be a tough person, to be tough, is very toxic. And this is a direct link to violence against women and exploitation, because of the need for society always saying, you know, men have to be tough, have to be very strong. And if those who we speak to our youth and say, okay, you know what, let's create a box, and those who fit into those gender expectations, or sorry, what do society say folks have to fit into those gender expectations? And folks say, they have to be tall, muscular, they have to be violent. And then, so what happens if they don't fit into that? Then they're called so many other things, and now they have to prove themselves. Youth have to prove that they're tough. Young men and boys have to prove that they have what it takes, where they have to invoke violence at times. So this is how we really try to connect with our youth as well, and you know, open this up as a discussion to speak about. So we spoke about, you know, those who identify as women and girls, and those who identify as men and boys, but how about those who don't identify with either or? And that is a gap in it itself, which is the LGBTQ2S youth community and youth. And we speak about the LGBTQ2S youth is because of how vulnerable and targeted they are as well, because of their identity, because of the lack of support, the lack of guidance and love from their family members, from their friends, that causes further isolation, as well as the lack of like services that are geared towards the LGBTQ youth community. And often they are discriminated against for their sexual orientation and gender identity, which creates a further gap in how they're able to navigate their lives, which makes them more vulnerable and more targeted to exploitation. So we speak about this. We also get into the Indigenous community as well. And the most vulnerable community here in Canada is the Indigenous community. And we know that if we do not speak about the Indigenous community, we are creating more harm, because the Indigenous community is the most targeted, because let's look at their history. So we speak about to the youth, we ask folks like, okay, how many folks have heard about residential schools and the impact that, you know, has happened here in Canada to Indigenous community? And a lot of youth, unfortunately, because of institutionalized systemic barriers, schools and institutions don't really bring forth the truth in what happened into the Indigenous community. So we take moments to unpack what really happened, to explain the barriers and the lack of resources that the Indigenous community have. We know that the Indigenous community, in terms of gender-based violence, exploitation, and human trafficking, and other forms of human rights, they experience it at worst conditions than any community here in Canada. So we really need to unpack, okay, what are some of the issues that are currently going on? And for us, again, to do no harm, this slide was actually created by Indigenous community members to really speak about the issues that are going on in the Indigenous community. And again, we know that we cannot have this conversation without acknowledging the Indigenous community. And again, I'm not going to speak too much about this because I know Melissa Compton is actually going to be coming in on April 27th to speak about the Indigenous community and the perspectives on human trafficking, but I really encourage folks to educate yourselves, to find more information on these topics and these communities, to continue to really understand what is the truth and what is currently kind of going on and the impacts that are there. So another community that we also speak about is the marginalization of the Black community. So going into the impact of colonialism, the legacy of the slave trade, as well as, and it's the biggest piece, the systemic racism and the systemic barriers that are there as a result to white supremacy. So we unpack this with our youth, especially when we go into, and youth, especially when we go into our marginalized communities, folks who identify as either Black, Indigenous, or from the LGBTQ youth, they get excited that, wow, like you're speaking about you're speaking about my community and how we've been impacted, and they want to share more, and they agree. They're like, yes, because of the fetishness of Black bodies, of folks wanting to have and really hypersexualizing Black bodies, but not wanting the Black, like a Black person themselves, like just the body of what they possess and what they can do. And we speak about that, how that is dehumanization, and that increases the vulnerability as well. So we unpack that, and our youth get really sometimes heated in these conversations of like, you know what, yeah, on social media, this is what we see, this is some of the impacts. So we really go through and impact some of the vulnerabilities and targets our different communities have, and how they all connect to human trafficking, to really bring in, again, our biggest viewpoint is that education and awareness and prevention piece for our youth. We also speak about consent and healthy relationship, because still to date, the most common scenario is being portrayed by a man. Youth first thought was their partner, their boyfriend. And this is exactly why we speak about consent and healthy relationships, because it's so important to unpack and kind of see red flags when you see certain things in a relationship. Because when we do our workshops, again, we speak about one also vulnerability is being in your first intimate relationship and not knowing what's a healthy relationship and what does that look like. So I felt like I went on a huge tangent and kind of went off, but what does this all have to do with human trafficking? Why are we speaking about the Indigenous community? Why are we speaking about the Black community? Why are we speaking about gender, healthy relationships, and consent? Well, just knowing the root causes of exploitation and working towards equity for all humans can empower youth to demand better, because simply they know that they are worth more healthier, vibrant lives. So by us really addressing these deep-rooted concerns in historic barriers, systemic racism, this really allows for the conversation to happen, to really advance equity in how we do our work. And the largest way of how we do no harm is continuing to support our survivors. So we end all of our workshops with this slide here, just speaking about the strength and the resilience of survivors. After going through so many obstacles in their daily lives and the different obstacles that they face every day, we really emphasize on being empathetic, practicing compassion, practicing kindness. And for some folks is like, that's so that's so we don't need to do that. But no, that literally can save and change a person's life, is practicing that kindness, being compassionate. Because if we continue to label, discriminate, and stereotype, that continues that spiral and that cycle of stigma, of shame, that sometimes can really of course, first of all, re-traumatize a survivor, and sometimes even re-put that can harm their opinions on themselves and kind of be put and go back into the game, or different things can occur. So one thing that we can all do, folks, all of us on this call, is when supporting survivors or encountering survivors or folks or folks who have experienced gender-based violence, is really practicing kindness and empathy, and really taking steps to unpack our biases and not portray our biases to folks. That's something that, we really advocate, and I hope folks on this call can really take from today's conversation in doing no harm. But now we want to look at some of our project impacts. So I'm going to be going through a survey results that we had from March 2019 to March 2020. So right before the pandemic hit. So again, when we were in person, after all of our workshops, folks would get a survey that they would fill out so that we can, collect data and continue to do the work that we do. So from these surveys, it's going to include 48 presentations that we did in that year in different like libraries, schools, shelters, different youth spaces. And it's going to have a total of 2,000 participants. So let's kind of get into it. So the first piece is getting into gender equity. 67% of our participants believe that gender equity will help end gender-based violence. And this is from our youth that are saying this and really showcasing like this is the impact that it could have. I think I skipped a slide, sorry. So we're on here, the prevalence of human trafficking in Toronto. So as I mentioned, for every single one of our workshops, presentations, we have a trauma counselor, thanks to the partnership of the Toronto Rape Crisis Center and other private counselors that do support us. Our workshops have resulted to, 50% of our workshops have resulted to face-to-face disclosures of human trafficking and sexual violence by youth participants. So 50% of our workshops. So this is youth really having the space to feel like they're being heard from our workshops and feeling safe enough to come forward and disclose and get the supports that they need. The next slide, I kind of went through that a little bit ahead of myself, so I shared that piece, but we'll get into the next results from our survey. So systemic issues. So we spoke about, do you feel the police exist to help you? And this is a question that it's a yes or no question to our youth. And 51% said no, that they do not feel that the police exist to support them and help them. And as I mentioned prior to, is because, I mentioned the history of the lack of mistrust and the lack of support that is given that, has resulted, especially for marginalized and racialized communities, where there's no support and there's a lot of mistrust there, where folks do not feel that the police is there to support them. So when we speak about, we asked our youth, okay, in your opinion, why are Indigenous youth particularly targeted by traffickers? And 20% said systemic racism, 17% said harmful stereotypes, 16% said the impact of colonization. So our youth know what's the impact, like after having our workshops, like ways to really connect, okay, what are the truth and why are the Indigenous youth community being more targeted? And lastly, another data I'm going to share is the validation of our approach. So we asked our youth, in your opinion, what is the key to ending human trafficking? So that's a huge question. And folks had a few options that they can choose from, and 27% said education. So our youth know that, we need to continue the education. A lot of the times, whenever we would finish our workshops, youth would come up to us and be like, you know what, I wish I had this earlier on. I didn't know this information was out there. My friend from this other class needs to have this information because I feel like they may be vulnerable and they need to hear this information. So we know that addressing the root causes to human trafficking and gender-based violence can result in change. And prevention really does work. So here on the next screen, here are just some testimonials from students and frontline workers that they've kind of provided as a result of our surveys. But in the next slide, I really want to kind of wrap up our data and survey information on, we get a lot of questions sometimes like, why do we focus on gender equity and anti-oppression? Why do we focus on empowering marginalized groups with knowledge and support? And genuinely and quite simply, it's because we know that it works. We know that education and knowledge really works, and prevention programs do work. Uplifting youth, empowering youth, and supporting youth, and telling them that they are worth and they have so much value empowers them. And it is very hard to empower. It is very difficult and very hard to traffic and empower youth. So that is some of the work that we try to do in all of our workshops and in any speaking engagements and stuff that we do have with youth. But here on our next slide, here are some human traffic specific services that we provide. So as I mentioned, our peer prevention project, this is the youth project that I was speaking about. So we are currently taking bookings. We have transitioned online virtually to where we still have our trauma counselor online to support our youth. We also have and do provide interim trauma counseling and safety planning for HT survivors, but we want to note that we do not offer crisis services, but basically interim counseling is counseling meant to support survivors while they are waiting for long-term therapy programs. This period typically is between 3 to 6 months. So what we do is like warm transfers to other services and also different organization as needed by the survivors. And we're very thankful to have these strong relationships with many diverse partnerships, which I'm sure a lot of folks are on this call today in the GTA to continue to support the women and youth that we work with. We also do have frontline, we do frontline HT human trafficking training for staff members and frontline workers, educators, and parents. This is either a half day or a full day. So folks, I'm gonna put my email in the chat box for folks to really, reach out if this is something that they're interested in. And we also do speaking engagements and further education for community members. And my email again is there on the side for folks, and I'm gonna put that in the chat box. But I'm very surprised that I kind of went through that really quickly. But I want to open the floor now to some Q&A, any questions and things that are there. And of course, if folks kind of wanted me to maybe go through some of the things that I went through too quickly, please let me know and I can go through that because we do have some time.
Great, thanks very much for sharing that with us, Asha. It's good to see some of the ways and the practices that Or Freedom is engaging in. We have got our first question coming through here. You've said that you know that offering education works. Have you done any studies or have any evidence to prove that it works more so than other types of support? So to be clear, I'm not saying education isn't important or doesn't work. I'm just curious.
Yes, no, and thank you so much for your question. And I genuinely believe there's no wrong question that is there. I think it's always an opportunity for folks to learn and get more information. So as I shared in some of the survey that we've been able to collect, so if we want to go to slide.
Sorry, that was my fault.
That's okay. That's okay. Olivia, if you want to kind of go to slide 29. So as I mentioned, we've been able to collect data and through our surveys that we conduct for our youth. And one of the questions that we asked is, what is your opinion to ending gender-based violence? And from our youth, they've said that it is education. So this is how we've been able to know that the work that we're doing, it does work and education does have its benefits. We also do have some articles on our website. I'm going to be sharing our website very briefly in the chat box for folks to explore that our executive director, Marissa, has supported with in really showcasing the impacts of education when it comes to human trafficking. So I'll definitely share that in the chat box very shortly. But again, thank you so much for that question. I hope that answered your question as well. You can let me know if it didn't as well. Maybe I can kind of go through some of the questions. I see I got a direct message here. Yeah, okay. So, okay, let's see here as I pull up some of the things. So the question is, can you explain the term intersectionality? And I think that's a great question. So the term intersectionality was actually coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. We actually have on our social media, we've started a campaign to end gender-based violence. We actually have a slider that goes into what intersectionality is and why it's so important to be intersectional. But intersectionality in a simple way is basically looking at the different identities that we all hold. So for myself, I'm a Black, Muslim, Somali, woman, and I can go on and on. These are all my identities, and this impacts the way that I'm able to navigate in different spaces. So for me, being a visible Black woman, for me being a visible Muslim woman, that impacts the way that we move in society. So we need to, when I went back and said we have an intersectional approach, so our approach is that we identify and we look at all the different identities that folks hold, and that's how we do the work that we do to continue to ensure that we're being intersectional, that we are acknowledging the different identities that folks carry, that folks have. But I hope and awesome, Leah just put in the chat box a nice, beautiful TED Talk by Kimberly Crenshaw, which is awesome. So thank you for that. I see another question here. Do you have a maximum number for participants in your workshop with young people? So in terms of now, since we are online, it is just subject to what we can host. So with our hosting platform, we do use Zoom. We do have a number of 100 participants that we can host for our workshops. But prior to when we were in person, we were doing much larger workshops for folks. I hope that kind of answers. I want to put here.
And then there's a question about how have you recruited peer and youth facilitators?
Ooh, that's a good question. So the Human Trafficking Peer Prevention Project actually started in 2018. As I mentioned, I actually started as a facilitator for the program. And the ways that folks heard about it was just through a circulation through different networks from different organizations that were doing gender-based violence, awareness, and different things like that, and different networks were sharing the call out for facilitators and coordinators to support with this workshop, and different organizations had the opportunity to suggest some folks that they thought would be, great for the role and things. So that's a way that we were able to get some folks. I hope that answered the question too.
Thanks, Asha. And I have a DM here. Could you speak more to the specific vulnerabilities Black youth experience that puts them at increased risk for human trafficking, and how
I'm sorry, the first part you said kind of cut out.
Oh, sorry. Could you speak more to the specific vulnerabilities Black youth experience that puts them at increased risk for human trafficking, and how service providers can improve their supports?
Okay, that's an amazing question. So thank you so much for that. Olivia, if you want to go to slide 20, which we were kind of speaking about the marginalization of Black youth. So the question, correct me if I'm wrong, is how are Black youth particularly, can you repeat the question, sorry, at the ending one more time? I'm not sure if, oh, there you are, yeah.
Yes, here, I'll copy it into the chat box. The general chat box.
Can you speak about the specific vulnerabilities Black youth experience? Okay, so thank you again. So the specific vulnerabilities that Black youth experience, first of all, going into, and we're going to speak particularly about youth, is systemic racism and institutionalized racism. So I'm not sure if a lot of folks know this, but this has been happening for many years. There's a direct link to the school to prison pipeline, as well as some folks say the pipeline of Black youth being put where they're prior in academic probably, and being, transitioned into apply or different factors like that. So what does this all have to do with youth specifically? So this is the systemic racism that is there, that Black youth are not educated, and that Black youth are not able to be in high academic spaces. So there's a lot of misrepresentation and misinformation that is there, where a lot of Black youth are being stereotyped and being criminalized while in schools and in different spaces that make them particularly vulnerable when we're looking at institutions. So in these school spaces where they're being targeted for maybe issues that they have nothing to do with, but because of folks' stereotypes and because of folks' biases that they do have, a lot of Black youth are being marginalized and being targeted. And this impacts the way that youth are now able to move. This also impacts the employment system as well, where we know that a lot of employment opportunities are being put in different communities where there aren't a lot of Black folks in those communities, to where it creates a further gap where not only are the Black community not able to apply, they don't even know about this opportunity of this employment because it's not even being outreached or being brought into their communities. So how does this put them at risk for human trafficking? So when there's a lot of barriers for employment, when there's a lot of barriers in the education system, when they're not given the right supports to, be to continue their education, to further their knowledge, when there's so many barriers there, when there's barriers in employment, that creates a huge gap. When they're not able to empower and really support themselves because of these barriers, this puts them in a further and increased vulnerability to human trafficking and gender-based violence, because there's so many gaps, there's so many vulnerabilities that are being put into there. And so the last piece is, how can service providers improve their supports, which I think that's a beautiful question to kind of wrap up that piece, is really going back to building that compassion and unbiased. And I think sometimes is being comfortable with not knowing and being comfortable with having to learn from youth. I think it's asking, okay, you know what, like, what are some of the things that, can service you and be of better supports? And being open to that, to where, if sometimes they may shut you down and be like, what are you talking about? But I think is really being able to be uncomfortable in those moments. And I think education, again, is the biggest piece. Asking these beautiful questions as well, because this is a learning opportunity to be able to be uncomfortable and to be like, what, like, I may not know, but I'm gonna figure it out. I'm gonna find more information. I'm gonna read some more books. I'm gonna participate in some different resources and webinars. And I think what folks are doing right now, being a part of these beautiful webinars, these web series, to really get those informations to better support youth. So I hope that kind of answered that question. I kind of went on a little tangent there, but please let me know if I answered it, or if I can kind of get more specific to it.
Asha, can you give us a specific example of like a policy or procedure that Aura put in place? Maybe you did something that didn't go quite as you wanted it to, and you learned and you changed a policy or procedure.
Okay, so like something that we've done to change the way we do. Okay, so basically before the creation of the youth HTPP program, so here at Aura Freedom, we actually just used to run the workshops that were from, and it was just run by different folks, and it wasn't youth led, but it was geared towards youth in terms of the education and the awareness. So one thing that was realized, and a gap that was there, was that, okay, we need to have youth, we need this program to be youth led instead of having facilitators who don't identify as youth. So that's how we were able to change our policy or change the practices that we've been doing and adapt and learn that, even though it was very important, there was still a lot of impact by still having these workshops not being youth led. But after taking some step back and taking some feedback, we were able to, see how much more of an impact it is when having youth facilitators and having that youth lens.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's important. Like, I appreciated that you were talking a lot about the things that Aura Freedom is doing to try and reduce harm, but recognizing that it's always a process, right?
Yes, definitely.
We're always growing and learning and getting feedback. Varka, do you want to unmute? Varka's got someone, I think someone messaged Varka with a question that I'm not seeing, that she's asking me to ask you, but I don't see.
Oh, okay.
Asha, can you speak more about the police and mistrust that marginalized youth have towards the police, which is preventing them to look for law enforcement support?
Okay, yeah, no, of course. So that's again a great question, and thank you so much for that. So when it comes to the gap that is there and the mistrust that is there within law enforcement and different marginalized community, with the BIPOC community, the biggest thing is we know what we've been seeing now from the past year, that has been really amplified on social media on the impact specifically with the Black community and law enforcement, and how there has been a huge mistrust. There has been falseful racial profiling. There has been falseful targeting specifically of Black youth when it comes to when youth are in different community settings where there's been a lot of harassment, unlawful harassment. There has been a lot of unlawful abuse that has been particularly to youth and other folks in the community, especially as well with the Indigenous community, where that has created that mistrust. Where it has created all those barriers, because we know that, you know, the law enforcement, they're there to, you know, support with law and things like that. But when there is not a safe space to be adequately, first of all, being spoken to, where you're not being stereotyped, you're not being discriminated against, you're not being talked down to, you're not being racially profiled, then there's already no more, the safe space is completely gone. So if there's no safe space, there's no opportunity to disclose to law enforcement. There's no opportunity to go to law enforcement to get that support. So I'm sure there may be some law enforcement here on the call. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in really rekindling that and going back into communities and building those relationships. And it definitely is not going to be easy. It's definitely going to take some time because of the history of mistrust, the history of abuse that a lot of communities experience and face. It's also going to take a lot of time to rebuild that kind of trust, and trust is very hard to be given. So that's kind of the ways that that occurs. I hope I answered that question.
Thanks, Asha. I've got another question here. Has there been any work around survivors of human trafficking in the developmental service sector?
That's a great question. So there has been a few. I'm gonna see if we can maybe share some. I know that at one time that we did do a workshop at a school that had a lot of youth that had some different developmental stages in their life and things that we were able to support with. But I think that is another gap. There's definitely another gap there where there's not a lot of support, and we know that that's another vulnerability as well. But I'm gonna see maybe what are some of the things that I can find that I can share with you. I'm gonna put my email here in the chat if you want to reach out to me, and then I can kind of send over some things. But that's another gap that we identified, that there's not a lot of spaces and information there.
Thanks, Asha. I don't see other questions. So I've got maybe one last question for you, because it's 3 minutes to 3. For folks out there who are trying to do this work, do you have 1 or 2 tips of what they should be doing when they're reviewing their practices, specific questions to ask perhaps that people should bring to as they examine their work?
That's a great question. So I think the biggest thing is including different racialized and marginalized communities into the work that you're doing when it comes to reviewing. So as I mentioned, some of our slides, some of the information in our workshop was actually created and supported through survivors, through Indigenous communities, Black communities, the LGBTQ community. So we really, as human beings, we're not the expert of everything, and we cannot learn and know everything as individuals. We need each other. We need communities to really support us and to really, you know, help us in aid in the work that we're doing. So I guess my I guess, call to action or ways to go about that is reaching out to different community members that maybe that you service or folks that you're focusing on, and really kind of get their opinions on that and kind of get their input and call and bring them in conversations that you're having to see if maybe that's something that they can review to ensure that your agency is being inclusive, that your agency is sharing the voices of all, is using an anti-racist, anti-oppressive framework in the work that you do.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much, Asha, for that. Thanks everyone who joined us here today for this conversation. I am putting in the chat box the link to our Eventbrite page. So that is where you can find the links to the recordings of our previous webinars, as well as information about the final 2 webinars in our series. So next week, we'll be having Renelle Bruder as a speaker. And she will be speaking a bit more about the engagement of survivors in anti-human trafficking work. She is a survivor who has started a survivor-led organization. So that will be excellent. And then Melissa, who we saw a clip of earlier, as Asha said, Melissa will also be doing a webinar for us in 2 weeks, looking at the importance of bringing a decolonial approach and lens to anti-human trafficking work. So thank you so much again, Asha, for your time. Yes. To all of our participants. I want to say
thank you so much to everyone on the call here for all the questions. Again, to you, Leah, to you, Varka, for really having the space to have us have this opportunity to speak about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Okay, take care. Bye.